Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Black of Black Market Leadership. In this podcast, I talked to author Benjamin Runkle. Last year, I read his book, Generals in the Making, and I loved it. Loved it. All caps there, loved. It's an incredibly important book. In fact, you'll hear me say at the beginning of this podcast that there's certain books which I consider gems, and I'm very selfish with them. Usually don't disclose what they are unless you work with me as a coach, because they're so important, and I had to do some research to get it. But this one, I decided to give out a secret, and this book is a fantastic book. It is a gem. And why? Why is it very important? It's about disruptors. It's about World War II generals, people who you probably wouldn't think are disruptors, but they were. And most importantly, this book is not about the war. It's not combat, not the military strategy. It's about them during the interwar periods between World War I and World War II. World War I ends in 1918. World War II starts in 1939. That's 21 years. What do you think happens to these generals during that time? Well, first of all, they're not generals, they're officers. They go through hard times, the very kind of times that entrepreneurs, business owners, thought leaders, the people who are struggling, who are trying to show that persistence, or who are being persistent. Everyone goes through these times, and these generals did. They went through the same types of, probably even worse than a lot of people, a lot of family issues, professional issues. I mean, even Eisenhower is being threatened to be court-martialed during his career. These guys went through really, really tough times. And I think it's an incredibly important book to see how they went through them, the things they did to develop themselves, the things they did to position themselves to ultimately become the champions of World War II. For that reason, for that reason, it's an incredibly important read. And frankly, I don't know of any other book that talks about these interwar years. Incredibly important read. I had a lot of fun talking to Benjamin Runkle. We talked, I think, for an hour and 20 minutes. And that's why this podcast is broken up into 3 parts. So this is part 1 of my discussion with Benjamin Runkle, author of Generals in the Making.
This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Welcome, everyone, to Black Market Leadership. I am very, very excited. We have an exciting guest today, Mr. Benjamin Runkle, and he is the author of a book that I read last year. And I would tell you, this book, look, people, as you know, I've interviewed authors. I've read a lot of great books. There's certain books out there which I consider gems. And there's such gems. I'm very selfish. I don't let other people know what I'm using. In fact, unless you work with me, I won't introduce certain books to you. This is one of them. This is one of the most important books I've read, and for a variety of reasons, which we're going to get into. But the book I'm talking about is Generals in the Making. Generals in the Making. And we have Mr. Benjamin Runkle as the author and as our guest. So hello, Benjamin.
Hi, Kevin. It's great to be with you today.
Well, thank you for being with me. And so just so the audience knows, can I call you Benjamin or call you Ben? What do you prefer?
Ben is absolutely fine.
Okay, perfect. And for the audience here, let me give a little background, a little bio to Ben here. So Ben is a former paratrooper and presidential speechwriter with a Harvard PhD and a Bronze Star from Operation Iraqi Freedom. Ben is dedicated to contributing to America's national security by better informing America's public and policymakers on strategic issues relating to United States defense and foreign policy. He is also, I believe you also you're a guest lecturer at Johns Hopkins. Is that correct?
Adjunct lecturer, correct.
Adjunct. And what do you lecture on?
2 courses. One is basically military strategy and national policy, and the other is modern conflict in the Middle East, basically very short introduction to the history of modern warfare in the 21st century.
Gotcha. Modern conflict in the Middle East. You know, I always think about, I think about some of the old SNL skits back in the 70s, and you remember the news, trouble in the Middle East. seemed like there's a lot of conflict. So it's been going on for a while.
It's definitely, unfortunately, it's a subject that's got a lot of wealthy material in it.
Oh, I bet it's rich. Yes, yes. So Ben, again, kudos to you. This book is really, not only is it a great read, it's a very, very important read. And I know you and I've talked briefly, but black market leadership. The one thing that I'm really focused on is focusing on disruptors and status quo breakers. When you say disruptor today, especially in the business world, in which most of my audience is in the business world, when you say disruptor, you're probably thinking of some kind of artificial intelligence, some kind of small business, some company that's really making waves. I don't think most people out there think of World War II or the generals of that era as disruptors or status quo breakers. They probably think they're more rigid and very formalized, very structured. But your book really is a story of disruptors. You talk about some of the biggest, some of the most important generals in our history, especially during World War II, and really just how they grow, how they develop. If I was to give the audience some descriptions about this book, I would say disruption, flexibility, persistence, something that's so huge in the business world today. We always hear about persistence, especially if you're an entrepreneur, constant development, all these things which I think entrepreneurs and small business owners need and must do. This is just a fantastic story. And the irony, I think, of what you've done, Ben, is so many books about World War II are about the war. They're about, the action, the actual battles. And this book, ladies and gentlemen, is not that. It's actually the generals becoming generals up to World War II. And I would tell you, if you're an entrepreneur out there, entrepreneurs and small business owners, they go through a lot of hard times. It could be very, very stressful. Well, what Ben here has done is shown some of the greatest generals, Marshall, Patton, Eisenhower, even MacArthur, the hard times they went through, some of the very depressing times. And these are things I don't think most people understand. So my first question to you, Ben, is before we actually dive into the book, what made you focus on this? Really, what inspired you to even write it?
Well, it goes back to when I was a first lieutenant with the 82nd Airborne back in the late 90s. I used to spend my days off, training, holidays, weekends, reading on my balcony. And one day while reading, I think it was Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy, I came across the fact that when World War II started in 1939, the U.S. Army was only the 17th largest in the world, something that's almost inconceivable today. I started to wonder, how these legendary commanders such as Marshall, Eisenhower, Patton, et cetera, could develop as leaders in such a small force that was starved for training, resources, and equipment. It was something that, seemed particularly relevant, in the decade between the Cold War's end and the 9/11 attacks, when, like the 1920s, 1930s, Americans tended to view war was obsolete, that, we were talking about the end of history and such. Yet, when trying to read about that again, as you noted, most biographies of World War II generals tend to either skip over the interwar period altogether or condense it into a single chapter in order to get into sort of the sexier part of World War II history, which is obviously the battles. Even though how to become a great leader is arguably more relevant to most young officers today than how to lead a corps division in battle. I mean, since 2000, there's really only been only less than a handful of American officers who have commanded a corps during wartime on the front. But every officer can learn, the lessons about preparing for it and what it takes to do to prepare to be in that moment.
That's very true. And I guess if that was your inspiration, give us a little bit of your background. Like you said, you were in the 82nd Airborne, so you're not automatically, but you're obviously inclined to military history. But can you tell the audience just a little bit about your background, what led you up to this point of even writing this book?
The long story, I guess I came from a family whose grandfathers served in World War II, and then the generation above was typical sort of baby boomers, 60s. And easiest way to pay for college was to sign up for ROTC. And I didn't really necessarily have interest in the military until suddenly I started getting letters from recruiters based on, test scores, extracurricular activities and such. but then so served for 4 years, and back in it's just such a different world to think of now. So when I was in Korea in '95 during the nuclear crisis there. I was in the 82nd in the late '90s, but it really did seem I was in a battalion where almost every officer who had gone through that battalion went on to be a colonel, went on to be a general officer. And in my year group, all but two of the officers eventually got out. It just wasn't, the training schedule or the training pace wasn't very high. It was a lot of time in the motor pool. As I say, this is what made you think of how do you train great future commanders, great future leaders in a time when they're not able to train fully for it. Went on out after the Army, I got a PhD in international relations from Harvard, and then served in various administrations, and I was a speechwriter in the White House when I got called up, and I went and served in Iraq with a multinational force, Iraq, for just slightly over a year in 2005 and 2006, in 2006 and 2007 in Baghdad, and since then have been various think tank and congressional jobs and such.
Wow. So I just have to ask, what's it like going from the military to DC, working in think tanks?
DC is actually a very pro-military culture, and this is something I never got around to it. I regret this, that you see in the pre-pandemic days, you see on the metro all the time, you see military personnel going to the various offices downtown, certainly going to the Pentagon. So DC is not as much of a culture shock for the military. I think the modern military has adjusted itself very much so to DC. So that part of it wasn't a shock. It was more the shocks were going from the 82nd to the Harvard Government Department, and then going from the academia, from the ivory tower into government. I think those were the greater culture shocks.
It would seem to me, so if you didn't know this, I was 6 years active duty. I was commissioned in '99 from VMI. And so that was pre 9/11. That was back in the days where, you could walk onto a military base easily. Anybody could. You just drive on and have fun. Things change after 9/11. But the one thing that I've really, really realized, in fact, I have a lot of conversations about this. One of the most important things of my personal education was being in the infantry, because it allowed me to see the effect of ideas. When you say something, it's one thing just to have an abstraction to speak it, just sound. It's another thing to actually practice it and to realize that words matter. The words have meaning. They actually, mean something in the world. And that kind of practical, that practical experience with people, with situations, really helped ground me. It really kept my feet to the ground. So I guess I'm trying to say is, when I say things, I understand. I think I understand the implication to people, to psychology, to how it could affect others. Do you think that kind of practical experience helped you at Harvard?
Yeah, well, that's actually, I've never thought of that in that way. Again, this was just such a different time in that I remember this was in the '90s, and I had people who had no experience with the military, it wasn't in people's living rooms like it would be for the decade after. And so very extremely intelligent people asking, seriously, so did you ever kill anyone when you were in the Army? And this was in the 1990s. I would have been in jail if I'd killed anyone in the military in those days. The thing that I think it did, and I think that it helped for academia, is that to be able to treat it like a job, and to be professional in the way that I went about conducting research, not anal retentively so, but my wife will laugh because she thinks I'm the most disorganized person, except for when I'm writing, and the ability to sort of organize. And I think that helped the discipline to, even though you don't have a 9 a.m. class, to get up and be prepared for the day of research, the day of writing. If I was teaching that day, or if I had called that, I think that helped.
Yeah. So that's just a fascinating background.
Just to say that's also probably helped me. I got out in 5 years when the average was slightly over 7 to complete all the coursework and write a dissertation. So I think that I got out of there more quickly than others because of that.
Oh man. Let's jump into this book, because I have a bunch of points that I like to go over with you. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you to give the audience, I want to talk about 4 generals here. We're talking about Marshall, Patton, Eisenhower, and MacArthur. I wonder if you could give us like a 30-second or a minute thumbnail. But I'd ask you this. Tell us about the generals, or and here's the thing: don't give us a Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica overview. Give us your overview. What do you think about this person? What are they good at? What are they not good at? Just someone you want to work with. Could we do that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that the book begins and ends with George Marshall. It begins with him accompanying John Pershing home from France in 1919, when he was then a relatively unknown aide to Pershing. And in the pictures on the docks in World War I, or in Hoboken, New Jersey in September of 1919, all the attention is paid to Pershing, and in the background of the pictures you see Marshall. And I think it's interesting because with time, 100 years later, we know that really Marshall ends up being the most significant person on the dock that day. And I end the book in 1953, I think October of 1953, at Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and Marshall's has been asked by President Eisenhower to lead the U.S. delegation to the Queen's coronation. And Westminster Abbey, which obviously a place of splendor on any day, is filled with the dignitaries of all of England, representatives from around the world, royalty. And as the American delegation, which also actually comprised, Omar Bradley was representing them as well, is walking down the aisle towards their places, sort of towards the front, everybody's rising. And Marshall, is about 80 years old at this point, and he leans over to Bradley and says, why are they all rising? And Bradley says, it's for you. And that the British held Marshall in so much esteem that they were all rising to show respect for him, and that Winston Churchill and Viscount Montgomery, Bernard Montgomery, Monty, they both, when they were in the official procession, because they were they held peerage, they broke out of the official procession to go and to go and say hello to Marshall and to shake his hand. So wow. I think that the story, in some way, that his arc is one of the keys to the story. That, and if you're saying, so the essence of Marshall is that, and why I respect him so much, that he was machine-like in his discipline. He held subordinates to the highest standards, but he always led by example and made sure those standards applied to himself as well. I mean, he twice offered to resign when he imposed an age restriction on generals so that they would be fit enough to be in the field during the war. He twice offered to resign as chief of staff to comply with the standards that he'd set. But FDR just laughed him off. He didn't believe anybody would ever be that selfless. But he was selfless both in his willingness to mentor subordinates, and he also released, whereas MacArthur was very selfish in sort of a way of collecting talented subordinates to him and keeping them under him so that he could always look good. Marshall always was willing to release his talented subordinates from his command so they could get commands of their own. And Marshall also had tremendous moral courage, that the way he met Pershing was basically standing up to him in a division headquarters in France in October 1917 and daring to tell the general of the armies that he was wrong. Similarly, he did a similar thing with FDR in 1938 when he was then deputy chief of staff. FDR is propounding some theory about how they're going to produce airplanes, and everyone who goes around the room, everyone's, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, Mr. President. And he gets to Marshall and he says, Mr. President, you're wrong. And it was to Pershing and FDR's credits that they respected someone who would tell them the truth rather than just tell them what they want to hear. But both times, Marshall completely risked his career to make sure that he had the moral courage to make sure that the right thing was heard, that the bosses heard the truth rather than just hearing what they wanted to hear.
So I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just
got 3 more generals to go.
So I made a promise to myself that I cannot spend the entire podcast talking about Marshall, and I'll tell you why. Marshall's become a real hero of mine, and I've told people this. I'm very honest. When I had VMI, we had the Marshall statue. I knew nothing about him, and frankly, I don't think most people knew anything really much about him either, other than the Marshall Plan. But it wasn't until I read The Generals by Tom Ricks, and I was blown away. I never realized just how important Marshall was, and I think I found this out later on. I believe, oh gosh, the I'm drawing a blank. The big Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker. I think Peter Drucker considered Marshall and Sloan, Alfred P. Sloan, like the two paragons of strategic leadership. Just not just a fascinating man, but it's funny when people think of, I think when people think of generals, they think of, of a Patton, someone's yelling and not yelling, but, just bombastic. He's got that strong personality, the force of personality. And Marshall really he was almost like a manager, but he was so effective. He just so impressive. Someone who really saw the whole picture that, I know some people at VMI, and I keep saying, if VMI, I know you got your reputation, but you guys should be ringing the Marshall bell every day. That should be your competitive advantage. We are the home of strategic leadership. I just don't hear it anymore. So when I read your book, when I read this on Marshall, it was just fascinating. And we'll get into some of the trials and tribulations, but congratulations though on writing this. And the one thing I do want to ask you is, you have such a great chapter about Marshall and Pershing, and many times people, I'm sure you've heard this, have compared Marshall to almost to like a George Washington. But then I realized when you look at Marshall and Pershing, it's almost like the Alexander Hamilton and George Washington relationship, where Hamilton did a lot of the thinking for Washington, at least did a lot of the writing. And it seems like that Marshall had that kind of relationship with Pershing.
Absolutely. That when they were in the War Department together, that Pershing, when he becomes chief of staff, Marshall is last of his wartime, is almost just about the last of his wartime aides with him, and increasingly becomes more important to Pershing in that he is basically seen. He's the person, and this happens obviously in a lot of organizations. He's the person who sees everything before it goes on Pershing's desk to make sure it's ready for him, to make sure before any of Pershing's decisions go out. So he became very much attuned to how the War Department worked, how the War Department interacted with Congress and the White House through his years as Pershing's apprentice. Pershing also, by this time, is sort of not quite checking out, but isn't, as he's reached the pinnacle and is starting to look towards what he's going to be doing post-Army, including he goes to France ostensibly to start to prepare for the Monuments Commission, but also he had a lover that he would eventually marry who was living in Paris, and he entrusted upon Marshall to pretty much take the job of writing the Chief of Staff's annual report, which in those days was a very big deal. So Marshall was basically the driving force behind most War Department initiatives in those years.
It's amazing. It really is. And as you write in here, again, for the audience, I'm kind of jumping around, but the one thing that if there's a lesson to learn about Marshall's career leading up to World War II, is the variety of jobs he had, and even the places where he was in the Army, where he spent time in China. I mean, he really was around the world, and that really helped him, I think, develop a holistic view, the kind of view you need a senior leader to have, not just to see the siloed units, infantry or armor, but to see the military and the civilians, the civilian world, to connect all of it. This seems that his education, that real holistic education, really, really help prepare him to be the chief of staff of the Army.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think you something that you said at the very beginning that I don't think he gets enough credit for is that Marshall was an incredible innovator in a way that he's typically portrayed as this very staid, sort of, as you say, managerial. But during his time, for example, when he was assistant commandant of the infantry school from 1927 to 1933, revolutionized the way that infantry tactics were taught, so that they were taught to be quick thinkers, to be improvisational in a sense, rather than being overly reliant on formal plans and following scripts. He emphasized the importance of teachers being able to speak extraneously on their topics rather than just reading canned lectures. And this is what produced 150 of the students there would go on to become generals during the war. 50 of his instructors would go on to become generals. And they, to this day, they still refer to it as the Benin Revolution. And this was his doing. Similarly, when he arrived as chief of staff at the War Department in 1939, again, completely revolutionizes, or not, I shouldn't say completely revolutionizes, but makes important innovations to the way that both the promotion system, procurements, et cetera, recognizing that the way that they did business for the 20 years before just wouldn't fly in the face of what he could see coming around the corner with the war and the inevitability of American involvement in it. So changing the way, going from a seniority-based promotion system to a merit-based system, the reorganization into divisions and corps that he engineered, it was very innovative in a way that I don't think he's necessarily given enough credit for.
Yeah, there's no, I don't know who said this, maybe but what is it? Amateurs focus on battles, and was it generals focus on logistics? Is that something that? Yeah, and it's funny that again, where you see a lot of these battlefield commanders, Marshall, even though he wasn't battle, well, he was in battle, but he never had a battle command, and to my understanding, back in those days, that could be a death sentence for him. That really could actually cap you from rising in the ranks. And what you find is with Marshall's background, with Marshall's history, there's so much focus on logistics, on organization, on the structural elements, and not the sexy combat thing that we all think about the military. But it was, I guess I'm telling the audience here, if you really want to learn how to rise in the ranks, you got to sometimes step back and do the ugly work or do the highly detailed work, stuff that I hate doing. But it's incredibly, incredibly important to have almost like that left and right brain equal, that they can actually balance one another. And he just, unlike so many other people I've known in my life who just specialize in one area, he was such a generalist, and not just, but he was a very good generalist. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes. I think the one thing, and I didn't write much in this book, is that he wasn't good. He would have been good. The time to see how he would have, the best clue as to how he would have been as an actual tactical commander is probably his time in China, when he's essentially in command of the 15th Infantry. He was technically on paper second in command, but there was an investigation into the commander of the regiment, who he was cleared, but that he had to effectively, therefore, there was enough turmoil in the leadership above him that he was essentially running the regiment. And in dealing with the difficulties of the Chinese Civil War, where the foreign legations, the troops defending the foreign legations in Xiangtin, were outnumbered basically 1,000 to 1 by the various warlords' forces that were operating in the area. And his ability to manage the situation, I think, speaks very well to how he would have done in combat, and or as a combat commander. And if you see how his closest proteges did, the people who learned to think like him, Joseph Collins, Matthew Ridgway, I think that's a very good indication of where his tendencies and proclivities were. I think as you say, his strengths, when you're chief of staff, that's what his job was to build and to feed and to clothe the army, which were incredibly, for the size of the army they were building, 8 million men, was an incredibly difficult thing to do, because there was no precedent for anything on that scale. They'd been very unsuccessful at it in World War I. They were entirely dependent upon British and French equipment, and so he knew that they had to avoid a repeat of that. I think, one thing that I think that I think as a global strategist, he got off to a bit of a rough start, in that he wanted a direct invasion of France before U.S. forces were ready, and the British sort of made clear why that wasn't viable. But I think by the end of the war, he started to do more homework on it, and he had a much better sense of it, so that he had become the dominant voice in the Joint Chiefs of Staff between the British and the Americans. So I think he started out, at the very beginning of the war, President Roosevelt had a better conception of what was necessary, but by the end of it, he was a quick study and was able to properly allocate resources and realize what was more important than others.
For the audience here, as Ben's talked about the Benning Revolution, that's Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the infantry. One of the most interesting elements I got in this book about Marshall was when he was developing himself and his peers and even subordinates or other officers. He would have, get this, he would have these Army officers, he would have them read economics, a whole variety, history, biographies, sociology. He would have these officers really, really expand their mind. And I've always believed this is a great practice of being able to identify common denominators. If you can spot common denominators and just different things in front of you, whether you're in China, whether you're in Brazil, whether you're in Germany, if you can see different things and still pull those common threads, that helps you think in your feet, and it helps you be flexible. So just the fact that he would introduce something that is so almost just extraordinarily innovative. I mean, are we overstating just how innovative he was to the Army? I mean, to my understanding, we wouldn't have mountain troops or even airborne troops if it really wasn't for Marshall's push to get the Army to innovate.
It's a tough question because how much of it was dictated by circumstances of where they would have to fight. I definitely think he was important. I don't know if you could say without a doubt that those elements of it were. I think one element that is important was that after 20 years of fighting and somewhat stagnation and getting an armor force created, a separate branch for the tanks, that he basically signed off on it very quickly, that he saw the potential in it. I mean, it goes back to Eisenhower and Patton as next door neighbors at the infantry tank school at Camp Meade, now Fort Meade, Maryland, writing articles proclaiming how important these were going to be in the future, and absolutely getting stomped or getting suppressed by the commanders, the leaders of the infantry branch and the cavalry branch, which Eisenhower was infantry, Patton was cavalry. And that for 20 years, there weren't a ton of developments, that we fell behind in tank development relative to certainly the Germans, the British, even the Russians. And that there were rumblings and that there were people who still continued to work on the problem in the 30s. But then when the sort of big revolution in 38, 39, they start doing maneuvers, and he signed off on it very quickly, whereas it is quite possible a different chief of staff might have continued to not suppress it, but have been much more hesitant, more reluctant, had, say, a Leslie McNair, who was a very great general in a lot of ways, but was not as forward thinking with regards to tanks as others were.
If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile